Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. Today's topic, we're talking about editing and self-editing, whether or not you should do that. And as a special guest today, I have Amy Scott. She is an editor and the founder of Nomad Editorial. And one of the cool things about her is that she actually lives in Mexico, so she's kind of back and forth between the States and Mexico. So welcome, Amy. I'm so glad
Thank you.
that you decided to join us.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. Well, I do have a list of questions that I've had different people ask about editing and the process and just all kinds of things. So we'll talk through each of them. And I like to encourage our viewers who are watching, listening in, you can go ahead and just leave a comment in the chat box, and we will definitely make sure that we address that. So one of the first questions I want to ask is, as an author, I really enjoy writing my stuff. And when it comes to editing, I really want to make sure I'm being a better writer. And so what are some of the ways that I, as a self-published author, can approach the editing of my own book even before I send it over to an editor?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I definitely find people tell me that working with me makes them a better writer, that they realize, just by looking at the changes that I've made, they realize things they could have done differently. But even before that, you can definitely do some things on your own, which are really important, obviously, if you're not going to work with an editor. But even if you are, they can help you just make sure that you're sending as clean a manuscript as possible, which can make the editor's job easier and save you some money. So there's a couple tips in terms of do-it-yourself or self-editing, as we like to say. Of course, there's spell check, grammar check, those kinds of things built into your word processing system. They obviously don't catch everything, but they're still a good place to start. And then there's a bunch of online tools that have been sprouting up. The one that I'm most familiar with is called Grammarly, grammar with an L-Y. And again, doesn't catch everything, and I don't always agree with everything that they say. But again, another helpful tool if you're doing it alone. And then I also suggest a couple things in terms of whatever can help you get a fresh perspective. So, sometimes that's just taking a break, right? If you've been working on this for so long, you can't see straight, just putting it aside for a day, a week, a couple weeks, whatever you can afford, so you can come back to it refreshed with new eyes and hopefully have some new perspective on it. And then another thing I find really helpful is to print it out or read it aloud. Both of those things offer you just a different relationship with the words, right? Like when you print something out, it just looks and feels different than when you read it on a screen. And if you read out loud, you might notice, oh, that just sounds really awkward, or I missed a word, or whatever it might be that doesn't really make sense. And also, either when you're reading out loud or just in another situation, just to take a slower look and a closer look. Read carefully, ask yourself if each sentence or paragraph really says what you want it to say. Think about how it's going to sound to other people who aren't inside your head. Something that comes up a lot is, I find, is clients use words like it or that or this, and they know exactly what they're referring to with those words. But to me or to another reader, that's not always clear, right? So I think that's in particular something to look at, is places where you're referring back to something, but it might not be clear to others what you're talking about. And the final thing for doing it yourself is to really look at being consistent. This is obviously something that I do with my work with clients, but you can also do it yourself in terms of making some decisions about, for example, are you going to spell out numbers or use numerals? Do you like the serial comma? Are there certain words or terms that you use that should be capitalized or italicized, and do you do it all the time? Right? I find so many situations where clients make something, they capitalize a word sometimes, but not all the time. So look at those kinds of things as well. And consistency is really one of the key ways, I think, to make your work more professional. So I'll stop there. I know that was a lot, and then we can move on to the next piece. How was that? Any questions or anything on that first part?
I actually really like what you said, especially about using like a formatter or like a tool that checks your words, especially something like Grammarly. I actually used that for the first time with my last novel, and it was so helpful to help me catch a lot of the redundancies in my book, especially the
Yeah.
things that I used to repeat these words, and it even told me when I was getting a little wordy. So that was fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they also have a plugin. I think it's just within Chrome, which is the browser I use. So it'll check your emails and your Facebook posts and everything as you're writing. So it can save you from all those random typos in everyday life as well.
Oh, I love that. And the plugin is actually free, so that's great. And we'll definitely, for you listening in, we'll link to Grammarly in the resources section under the video so that you can, check that out later. So that'll be quite helpful. And then one of the other things you said about reading it out loud, like that
Mm-hmm.
one is huge. And I'm finding too that actually pulling the book up and putting it in the format for an ebook, like a Kindle book or an EPUB for iBooks or something like that, and reading
Mm-hmm.
it on the actual device gives me a different perspective too. And it's surprising because I'm like, how is this different from what I'm seeing on the computer? Like, how is this so different? And I'm like, oh, there's all these typos.
Yeah, it's true. In fact, I think probably along the same lines, even just like changing the font size or changing the font that you're using, right? Because then if you've been looking at the same text for a long time, you might even, depends how, kind of visual you are. I tend to do this where I can even picture like where on the page something is. And so then if it has been completely shifted because now the font is bigger and so there's different, a different number of words on the page or whatever, I think even that, and I think that might be happening too with the ebook thing, is that it just looks different even though it is still a screen. So yeah, I think anything that's creating that new perspective, however you get it, is a good thing.
Yes, I really like that. Those are all excellent tips. While we're still on the subject of self edits or what you can do to get your manuscript ready before sending it to an editor, at what stage do you recommend authors include beta readers? And what do you recommend that they really ask for from those kinds of people?
Yeah, that's a good question. And actually, this ties in a little bit with my next point, which was around kind of a buddy system. And I think a lot of those same things can apply to beta readers. So we'll get to that in a minute. But to answer your question about when, it's an interesting question. And I don't actually know that I have a really concrete answer or opinion on this. I've had clients asking me about this, like, should I do beta readers before or after? And it kind of goes both ways. Like I can see pros and cons to both. In terms of, what I've been telling people is if they get beta readers first and those people help them, say like, why do you have this chapter in here at all? Or, like really help them fine tune the content and finalize what they're really trying to say, then that can be effective to do before the editor comes in, because otherwise you're paying the editor to edit content that you might not keep, right? Which can be unfortunate. But on the other hand, an editor can help you really polish things as well. And sometimes I think it can be helpful for beta readers to see something in a more final form, right? Instead of being distracted by typos and unclear language that an editor might be able to help you or will be able to help you clear up. So yeah, I keep going back and forth on this, and I really see benefits to each side. So have you done that yourself, Angela? What's your experience been?
Yeah, I tend to do it twofold. Like I'll have beta readers really focus on the story and not necessarily, what's the grammatical part of it. But I'll typically do that before I ever send to an editor, and that's very helpful just to get that feedback. Because you're right, there are things where I'm like, I know what's going on, and everything is in my head, and I've got it, and then I spit it out and put it on paper, and people are like, "Where are you going with this?" I'm like, "Oh, okay, let me clarify." But it helps to know that, and then after editing, when it's more its final format, that's when I bring in my advanced review team And it's not really to make any changes at all. It's just to read it and leave a good review.
Yeah, that's a good point. Right. Those people, there can be different groups of people that are really serving different purposes. And I think also there may be a difference there in terms of fiction versus nonfiction. And I can see how beta readers for your fiction can really help, like you said, with the story and characters and things that just, you know, storylines that don't follow through or those kinds of things. I primarily work on nonfiction, where obviously those kinds of things, unless it's a memoir, are a bit less of a concern. And it's more just about whether the content is really reaching people and serving your readers. So yeah, that's an interesting thought to look at both the beta readers and then your advanced review team, as you put it. So I'll jump into some of the tips for the buddy system, which you can also keep in mind as possible things to talk to, you know, ask your beta readers for, which you were just asking about. So again, you know, just as finding a fresh perspective to look at your work again is really helpful. Definitely one of the benefits of working with an editor or having a buddy or a beta reader is to get that outside perspective. And there, as you were just saying, Angela, there are always going to be things that seem totally obvious to you, but it's because it came from your head. And you just might not realize that it's something's missing in what's actually on the paper, that it's not, that connection isn't being made for readers. So a couple tips in terms of things to ask them to look for. Anything that's distracting, confusing, inconsistent, or repetitive, things that, you know, are taking them away from the story, or especially in terms of fiction, you know, a character that gets mentioned as and seems really important and then never shows up again, whatever it might be. And then if there's other specific things you want them to pay attention to, like maybe there's a particular chapter or section or character that you're struggling with and you'd really like your feedback on that, their feedback on that in particular. Or if you know you tend to be wordy, or, you know, whatever you think your weakness might be, you could also point that out. But I think there can also be a benefit of not saying anything in terms of don't give them any guidance and just see what shows up, because you might be surprised by the things they pay attention to if you don't give them any specific direction. Another thing is to tell them who your target audience is, which perhaps is a bit more relevant for nonfiction, but I think could apply to fiction as well, so that they can really keep in mind the perspective of your ideal reader. And in fact, even better, find beta readers who are your ideal reader. And then also, if you can, get a specific deadline, give them a specific deadline for getting their feedback. This is one thing I hear a lot, is when people go to friends or to, you know, a group of beta readers asking for feedback, that people don't always take the deadline seriously. So, you know, maybe you give them an earlier deadline than when you really want to have it back, and really encourage them to be on time, send them reminders, those kinds of things. So, so you stay on track.
I really like that, the deadline reminder, just saying, hey, like, here it is. Do you have time? This is how long it is. This is when I expect the feedback. Like, that's so helpful. I really like that. And then the point you made about, you know, telling them who your targeted reader is, I think that's definitely very important for nonfiction, equally as important for fiction as well. Like if you're writing a young adult book and it's more like an adult novel, yikes. That's a yikes.
Yes, totally.
So yeah, just really getting, and there's just so many different genres with fiction and, you know, even nonfiction as well. It's just really important knowing who are you writing this book for? Who do you expect to buy it? So
exactly.
Excellent tips. Well, one question with editing is the big one. Why do authors need an editor?
Right. So as we just talked about, obviously the outside perspective that an editor can bring to the table is huge and something you just really can't get on your own, right? But then, and of course, then people say, well, but I can, you know, I can have my mom do it, or I can have my friend do it, or whoever. And again, certainly better than nothing. But I definitely find from the experiences people have told me about is that often they don't, as we just mentioned, they might not be serious about deadlines, and so they're throwing off your whole schedule with the book. They might not be as detailed and thorough as you would like them to be. Or they might not be as honest either, because, you know, it's your friend or your mom and they're worried about hurting your feelings. So somebody who does this all the time, who is good at being honest yet diplomatic, you know, it's a fine line, and who obviously, you know, this is all I do, so I take deadlines very seriously. I map out the time on my schedule, and any professional editor should stick to deadlines. And also, they're really well versed in all the particulars of grammar and punctuation and other aspects of language that you or anyone else that you might ask to help you might not be. So those, I think, are the key things. And also, I just like to say, because this comes up a lot, is that also a professional editor should stick to, should honor your voice and make sure that it still sounds like you, only better. I definitely have heard from a lot of writers that they're worried about having someone come in and, you know, change it all around and it doesn't even sound like them anymore. But a good editor really has this knack for kind of getting into another person's voice and another kind of writer's persona. And so it still sounds like them, just better than what was originally there. So those, in a nutshell, I would say are the benefits and the reasons to work with an editor.
Okay, I really like that you did bring up that an editor needs to, you know, not take away the author's voice, but make it better, because that's a huge thing I've heard. Yeah. And that's one of the things that I've heard people talk about when it comes to editors, and they're like, well, I don't want someone to edit out my voice, so I'm just going to, you know, go this route and have someone like read it and like fix my errors and just get over it. Which, like, I really am a firm believer in editing, because, you know, people say this line all the time: if you don't pay for editing now, you will pay for it later, either in poor reviews or, you know, why is my book not selling? Because no one likes it, because the ed is not edited. It's just like this very raw form. So
definitely,
it's one of those things, like when you go to the movies to like watch a movie, it's done, it's finished, it's complete. Like, you're not seeing, like, you know, the set in the background and a camera hanging out, and you're not going, whoa, why is that in there?
Yes, that's a great analogy. I can definitely say I've, yeah, when manuscripts come to me, they often are in that state where there's, you know, you can see the microphone and, and things just aren't quite right.
Yeah, so I'm curious, when you get a manuscript, how many times do you typically read it over? Like, do you read it one time just to get the feel of the writing before diving into your different, to your edits? Or, you know, what does that process look like? I know I'm skipping ahead, but I'm really curious.
Yeah, no, that's totally fine. Yeah, I have to be honest, I would love to read everything like a million times, but I just don't have time. And I would have to charge way more than I do to cover that, you know. And it may be a little different with fiction editors. Again, I focus on nonfiction. Usually what happens is, well, it depends when an author comes to me in the process. If we do work together on several rounds of editing, then obviously I read through the book several times. But if they show up fairly late in the process and they're just looking for a straight copy edit or even just proofreading, I usually only have time to read it once. Sometimes I'll do my edit and then, you know, turn off, like hide the track changes and just kind of skim through it again and just make sure everything looks okay. But yeah, unfortunately, I assume I'm not alone in this. I haven't talked to a lot of other editors about it. It's just so time consuming, you know, that there's often not time. But if someone comes to me earlier in the process and we're working on more of the development and the structure of the book, and then they come back for editing, you know, there may be several, I might review it several times.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I like that. Because, I mean, the more time you spend like pouring into that book, like, I can't imagine. I mean, I sit with my books for months, just like reading them over and over again.
Right. And, you know, actually, I think in a way, I think, you know, this isn't why I do it, but I think there is a bit of a benefit to an editor coming in cold and doing their work when they're not familiar with it, because that's where a reader is coming in, right? A reader is, unless, you know, they're a huge fan, they're probably not going to read your book more than once. And so I don't know, I feel like it kind of replicates the experience of the reader in that sense.
Oh, I haven't thought about it like that.
Yeah, I hadn't really either until just now.
Very nice. That's a quotable right there. Awesome. Well, so as an author, when I'm looking for an editor, like what should I look for? What are kind of the qualities I should look for, and what makes an editor qualified to be an editor?
Yeah, you know, it's a little tricky just in the sense that it's not like, well, there are some certification programs and stuff like that, but a lot of editors don't have that certification. I don't, even though I've taken some editing classes. It's often a combination of, you know, natural talent and interest and on-the-job experience. So I do think that there's benefit to working with someone who's been doing it a long time. I've definitely found it something that, you know, every piece that I work on, I'm learning from and improving my craft. And, you know, I think that there's no question that I'm a much better editor now than I was, 15 years ago. So it's not necessarily a question of looking for like a specific, you know, degree or certification or something like that. But definitely I would look for any information about other books that they've worked on. You want to look for someone who ideally has worked on similar books to yours in terms of genre or subject matter. You want to look at the types of editing that they do. Because, you know, if you're looking for a proofreader and they don't do proofreading, then obviously you can move on. And other than that, I also think, you know, it's just kind of getting a gut feeling from looking at somebody's website. Hopefully they have one. And, you know, how forthcoming are they with their experience and the way they do offer their services, and, you know, maybe testimonials or references from past clients. All of those things can certainly go a long way in making you feel more comfortable with an editor. Also, most editors I know, myself included, will offer a sample edit if you ask for it. Primarily, I don't do it for proofreading, but for more involved editing jobs and on anything longer than like 10,000 words, I will do a sample, which I think is really the best way for me to show my skills to somebody. I do actually have a couple samples now on my website, but a lot of editors don't, because, you know, each project needs to be handled according to the problems it has, right? And so the way that I handled one manuscript might not necessarily be the way I would handle another one. And I feel like it's most helpful for you to see how I'm actually working on your writing. And so then you can really get a feel for what it's going to look like when I'm done. So definitely ask, you know, they might say it on their website. If not, you can definitely ask editors if they offer samples and ask for that. Oh, and one last point on that is if you do send out samples, send the same sample. If you're sending out multiple, you know, kind of testing out multiple editors, send them all the same sample. So then you can actually compare their work on the same piece. It is fascinating. I've, you know, at several points been looking to subcontract editors. So I've done some of that process myself, and I'll send the exact same text to 5 different people and the results are completely different. So it's definitely something where you want to make sure that, you know, it feels good and you like the way that they're approaching your text and you like the way it looks when they're done.
Okay, that's an awesome tip. I always pick one editor and I'm like, okay, here we go.
Well, and if you're happy with what they show you, then you're good, right? But if you're not sure, you might as well have someone else take a look.
Yeah, that's an excellent way of going about it. And yeah, editing can be tricky. I heard you mention the different types of editing, and I wanted to ask you to go over those really quick, just in case some people aren't aware of what they are. Because when I first started writing, I had no idea. People are like, "Oh, what kind of edit do you need?" And I was like, "An edit."
Yes,
that's what I
exactly. Exactly. And it's interesting because I think a fair number of editors like me came from a traditional publishing background where we didn't have to explain that stuff to anybody because everyone knew what we were talking about. And so now, as you know, we work with self-publishing authors instead, we realize, okay, yeah, we have to make sure we're all on the same page. And it is tricky because there's actually several terms that are either overlapping or that different people define differently. So I recommend, in addition to using, you know, like specific terminology, that you also clarify what you mean by it or clarify what the editor means by it. For example, there's developmental editing, substantive editing, and content editing. There may be other terms, and they're all more or less the same thing, in my opinion. There may be someone out there who would disagree with that, but you know, this is about looking at the bigger picture of the manuscript, looking at tone, looking at structure, looking at organization, you know, possibly rearranging chapters, and you know, really looking at the overall structure. And for example, I actually am going to change this because on my website I refer to it as developmental editing. And a couple of people came to me recently and said, I'm looking for substantive editing. Do you do that? And I don't know where they got the term from, but I realized that they have a term in their head, and then they look at my website and say, oh, it doesn't say that you offer that service. So luckily they reached out anyway, because yes, they are the same thing. But yeah, so you may see on an editor's website specific terms. Hopefully they've also defined them so you can get a sense of whether that's what you're looking for. Then there's line editing, copy editing. Those might be the only ones. Line editing, some people say, is kind of between content and copy. It's like more detailed than like developmental editing, but less detailed than copy editing, which is why they call it line editing, because it's like looking at it line by line versus, you know, like whole paragraphs or chapters at a time. And then copy editing can also be broken down into heavy, medium, and light. I just say copy editing, and I offer, you know, I basically do what I see is needed in the manuscript. And in fact, that's something too, is when you have an editor doing a sample for you, you might be able to say to them, I'm not sure what I need. Can you, you know, do the sample like at the level that you see, like as you see fit, and then let me know, you know, how we should proceed. So I often will do that, where I say, okay, I've done a pretty heavy level of copy editing here. This is what I think is best going to benefit your manuscript. You can tell me, you know, if you want a little bit more hands off, I can be hands off, but you know, here's my recommendation. So yeah, I think probably the difference between copy editing, in my mind, between copy editing and proofreading is really about, I picture that when someone comes to me for proofreading, they're pretty much done, right? Like in traditional publishing, the book is actually laid out, page numbers and everything before the proofreading's done. So you can't just like cross out a sentence or something. It's going to screw everything up. So proofreading is a good option if you really just are looking for the worst mistakes, you know, the typos, the like missing periods or whatever. But don't really want any feedback on how to make it better, because it's kind of too late, right? Like you've moved on. Whereas in copy editing, I will often be asking questions, not rewriting, but kind of rephrasing things to make them sound better, to make them more clear. And I might be asking questions like, this doesn't totally make sense here. You know, can you explain, or can you expand? Or as I said before, someone might say, this is similar to such and such, and I'm not sure what this refers to. So I might ask for clarification. So that's a lot of what can happen at the copy editing phase that you would not get if you were asking for a straight proofread. I feel like that was a little bit all over the place. Hopefully it was not as confusing as I felt like it was in my head.
No, it was good because you broke it down between like the super heavy edits all the way up to like the lighter stuff, which is proofreading. It's kind of funny that you say like the proofreading is when everything's like laid out, because I have this habit of like formatting my books before I send them off for editing, just because I need to know the page count for my designer so that she can just go ready version. So yeah, it's ready to go. But that makes everything like very clear, like seeing, you know, if I'm maybe struggling with my writing process and I need some help getting the word across, like that's early on in the phase, maybe where I would go in and hire you. Or if, you know, my book's completed and, you know, maybe there are some minor revisions that might need to happen, that's where I would go for more of the line editing, the copy editing, just to make it better. And then maybe even follow up again with a final proofread afterwards.
Yeah,
so
exactly. And just
speaking of that,
I think, or not, I think it's just important to point out that some editors do all of those phases like me. And then there's some editors who only do one piece of that, either because they prefer it or they're specialized in that or whatever. So again, looking at, you know, what that person can offer. And also I think if you get, I often will do like developmental or content / substantive editing and copy editing for the same book. But then I often recommend they bring in someone else to do proofreading, because by that point we've both looked at it a million times. And now it's, you know, a good idea to get that one last set of fresh eyes.
Oh, you know, I really like that. And one of the first editors I worked with for my first novel, what he did is he proofread the book, because it was just a straight proofread. But he proofread it and then he sent it off to one of his other proofreaders. I guess he had a whole army of them, so it seemed, to read the book. And, you know, I was like, oh, how's it going? He was like, oh yeah, my proofreader is going through it and then I'll finish up and send you notes. And it was really cool. I didn't know that was happening. So
yeah, that's interesting.
Two different eyes on it, which I recommend.
Yes.
But yeah, so tell us a little bit more about your editing process. What does that look like once, you know, the author says, okay, here's my book?
Yeah, so it depends obviously a bit depending on where in the process I come into the picture. And it's basically, I think the most significant thing that is important to know and be kind of prepared for is how the editor is going to, what program that they use, like to actually do the work. And, you know, so how you're going to manage the files back and forth. I've been having this conversation with someone just this week, and we're having a little file matching situation. So I usually work in Microsoft Word. Some authors and perhaps some editors prefer other programs. You know, obviously you can be writing or editing in Pages, in Google Docs, in OpenOffice. There's all kinds of in Scrivener. I found that Microsoft Word is the most robust and just the most streamlined in terms of, you know, what I need to do in my workflow. So I use Word, but the good thing is that it's compatible with most of those other programs. And so if necessary, you can be, you know, importing and exporting files out of various programs as you go, and just make sure you keep all the versions straight. And then usually you want an editor who's going to use track changes. Again, that is available as a tool in most of the word processing programs, so they work a little bit differently. And then I usually send several versions, and I don't know if other editors do this, but it seems to work well with my clients, is I send the full track changes version so they can see absolutely everything that I've done. And then I send a version with just the comments showing, so they can see, you know, what types of questions and feedback I have without being distracted by all the red stuff. And then I also send a totally clean version with all the changes accepted. So, and I usually recommend they start with that version actually. So then you can just read through your book, and just see how it flows and see how it sounds and how it feels without being distracted by like, what? Why did she put a comma there? Because you might not be bothered by the comma if you're just going along and reading it like any reader would. And then it depends on whether you have an arrangement with the author or with the editor to, to do numerous revisions or, multiple rounds back and forth. Usually in that case, I recommend that authors accept all my changes and or accept the changes they want to. Usually, luckily, they accept all or most of them, and then make their changes with track changes turned on also. So then when I get it back, I can see what's changed. And, as we said before, I don't normally read the whole thing again unless they ask me to. So that way I can just go straight to the sections that are new or that have had significant changes, and then clean up that text and make sure, like if I said to somebody, as I mentioned before, like this part isn't totally clear, can you expand on this? Then I can look and see, oh, they did actually address that concern and now it sounds much more clear. I think those are the basics. Any other questions around that?
Yeah, that sounds great. And I like that you do the 3 different versions. I've kind of a rookie on this, so I've never heard of that before, but that's really neat. And I totally understand the whole part with like, the using Word or using something else. I personally use Scrivener and I export it to Word and then import it back in chapter by chapter with all the comments so I can see what happened. But it's one thing with being a self-published author, like I really like having the control. So while I do like seeing the clean version, I also want to know everything that happened. Like, okay, comma added there. Like, sure, that's good.
Yeah.
But this sentence, oh, you want to change that? Like, that was my favorite sentence. No.
Right. Well, and again, editors handle this stuff differently, but also if I change something and I have a hunch that the author, sorry, there's some really loud motorcycles outside or something.
Oh, no worries.
If I have a hunch that there are going to be, like you just said, like, what? Why is she changing this? That part's really good. I will often make a comment about why I changed it. So at least it gives them a little, food for thought in terms of like, well, okay, maybe she's right, instead of just saying, no way, I'm not going to change that. I'm keeping it the way it was. One other thing I was going to mention too, because this just came up with a client and it was really funny. Luckily, I think she freaked out at first and then everyone was happy in the end. You have to be sure that when you get the files back, that you actually have, so like in Word, for example, and I think in most other programs, you can turn on or off not just the actual tracking of the changes, but being able to view the changes. So she received my feedback and there were almost no comments in the entire manuscript. And yeah, actually, I think it was completely empty. She was like, is this really the right version? Are you sure? And I paid you all this money, like what? And it turned out, and it's funny, she didn't write to me. She figured out herself eventually that she had not selected to like show markup. And suddenly, there are all these comments. But it's come up several times, and it's something that I'm actually going to start reminding people when I send back the files, like make sure that you've got it turned on, otherwise you're not going to see anything. And I promise I did do a lot of work here.
Yeah, and I love that. The comments actually are some of my favorite parts. Like I just like love going to the comments being like, okay, what do you think of this part? And I know it's a little different with fiction versus nonfiction because, I have like crazy plot twists going on and I'm like, ooh, what does she think? But yeah, the comments are so helpful, especially with going back to the whole like, self-editing my book or making sure my version is as clean and as ready as possible before I turn it over for editing. It really helps going through the comments and seeing like, oh, you know what, this is one of my bad habits. And now I know this. So my next book, I'm not going to continue with that terrible habit anymore.
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, again, just like we mentioned with, if you're working with a friend or you have beta readers or whatever, if there are specific things that you either already know are kind of your bad habits or things that you're just not feeling totally confident in, definitely point those out. You know, say like, I feel like chapter 2 is the weakest, you know, like please really put some, you know, extra attention on that. Or, you know, I'd really like to hear your feedback on that chapter in particular, or whatever it might be. Because they might not know that unless you tell them.
Yes. Yeah, that's so helpful. Just having kind of having those notes to say like, okay, here's the part where I really struggle. Let's look at this. Love that. Yeah, so my final question, I guess, is more about the budgeting or the pricing for an editor. But on average, I guess, like I know that the budget for books really depends on a lot of different factors, including like how much work is needed, the word count, all of that. But what's the range of a budget that an author should put together for the editing? Because it is a very important part. And I really think, sometimes people underestimate how important the editing is and how much it really helps with further down the road continuing to sell books and get those reviews and building a platform for yourself as an author so that you can continue to have an excellent reputation. So what would you recommend for authors who are kind of new and don't really know what kind of budget they should put together for editing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And unfortunately, there is such a huge range out there that I feel like it's really hard to come up with an average. I think really the best way to probably come up with an accurate estimate for your book in particular is to start looking for an editor like really early on, and just get, even if you don't actually sign a contract or anything, but check out some people's websites, maybe even get to the point of sending them a sample or whatever, just so you can get a feel for their pricing. And if you find someone you really like, and then you have their pricing and you realize, okay, so based on how long I think my book is going to be, et cetera, then I know I'm looking at this kind of budget. Because honestly, well, and yes, also it hugely varies depending on if we're talking about proofreading or we're talking about, the really big picture structural stuff. I've seen anywhere from like fractions of a cent up per word, up to like 8, 9, 10 cents a word, depending on, again, the level of editing, the editor's expertise, and any number of other factors. So yeah, I think probably the best thing to do is start looking for editors that you think might be a good fit for you and getting a sense of how much they charge and framing your budget that way. It's such a wide range. There's people on Upwork, and then people I don't know. There's some very cheap editors on Upwork, but not necessarily with the kind of experience and expertise that are going to give you a product that you're really happy with. I've certainly heard some horror stories about Upwork, but I know there's also some good people working there too. But and I think it's a fine line between finding somebody who is a fit for your budget, and yet, just because of some of these horror stories, like I'm not one for scare tactics or anything, but it would be a real shame to hire someone solely based on budget and have them just, not fulfill your expectations. And then you've spent money that, like now you need a new editor because that one wasn't good and you've blown half your budget, So again, the sample can definitely help with this, I think, to give you a sense of what you can expect from a certain editor and if you're happy with their work. Sorry, I can't give a more specific answer. But tying in with that also, just in terms of other places to look for an editor besides Upwork, depending on where you live, or where you're from, there are a number of different editing associations. Like there's one in Canada. The one in the US is called the Editorial Freelancers Association. They have a directory on their website of all their members. Also, if you're in a writing community, whether that's online or in person, you know, ask other people, especially people who write in the same genre, who they recommend. And, or even just ask friends. I've gotten several projects just from random people posting on Facebook, like, I need an editor. And then someone I know sees it and tags me. And, you know, so there are all kinds of, the internet is an amazing place, and you can find all kinds of ways to get connected with what you need. So.
Oh, that's perfect. Such good advice. And I really like the whole starting early. I actually asked for a quote for an editor before I'd even like finished writing a book, just because I was like, all right, like I'm gonna be on top of it. And then I got writer's block and it took me forever to finish.
Yeah, it happens. Well, and also the other part of starting early that can be helpful for kind of, you know, your timeline moving forward is to get a sense from an editor of what their turnaround time is like. You know, like how far in advance would you need to schedule time with them? You know, how far out are they booked? And then also in terms of, you know, like say my book is, I don't know, 50,000 words, like how much time do you need to get that back to me? So then you can factor that into your schedule as well.
Okay, good, because that was going to be my next question, like how much time should you factor in? And one of the things I would definitely say to people listening in as well, give yourself time before you release your book. Give yourself at least like 4 to 6 weeks after you get your book back from the editor to like do your edits and proof your print copy of the book before you even publish it. I found that even having like just a month like doesn't give me enough time. And I'm like, especially if you're planning like a book release party, you need to have your books there. You need a lot of time to get those books shipped to you unless you want to pay $500 in shipping, which
right.
no one does. But you need that time to like read through your book, proof it, get your questions answered, order your print copy, make sure it's all formatted correctly. If the format is off and wonky, it's probably going to take you an extra week or so unless you rush the book. So that's one of the lessons that I've learned that I will just pass on and give yourself even more time.
Definitely. That's a really good tip. There are so many times that people tell me their schedule, and I'm like, well, this is my schedule. And they're like, oh, great. That works perfectly because my launch is the next week. And I'm like, okay, like if you think that's enough time, but yeah, you know, you do what you got to do. But if you can build in more time, absolutely. And it's not the kind of stuff you want to be stressed about. I've also had people, you know, depending again on the level of editing that you request, it's easy to underestimate how long it's going to take you to go through the editor's changes and address those changes. So you definitely want to factor in a relaxed schedule to be able to handle all of that. So you're not like staying up all night for 3 days in a row, just trying to get through it all.
Yes. Oh my goodness. Yes. Like I know that nonfiction tends to be a little shorter than fiction. And I write like these monstrous novels. So when I get my book back, I'm like, I have about 120,000 words to get through myself, and comments and changes. So definitely have to book out time for that. And even after that, then there's more things to do, like the formatting of it and just all kinds of stuff. So yes, absolutely. Give yourself time.
Yeah.
Even if it's just an ebook that you're releasing still.
Exactly. My eye has been doing this crazy watering thing all day and I just can't get it to stop. Okay.
Oh, I know how that goes. It's like one of those like screen staring things, and I have to put tears in my eyes.
Yes, I actually didn't do that today. Maybe that's what I need.
Yeah. Oh gosh, good. Well, I think these are all the questions we have for right now. And yeah, is there anything else or anything else that came up during our discussion that you want to share with our listeners? Or
let's see, I'm just looking through my notes a little bit. I think we really covered everything. Oh, here's one other tip for where to look for an editor that I forgot to mention before. Not always, but sometimes self-publishing authors, either on the copyright page or in the acknowledgments, they mention their editor. And so that can be another place to look for an editor, is to look at books that you enjoy or that you admire and see who edited their work, and then you can contact that person.
Oh, yes. I love doing that.
You've done that.
Oh, yes.
Yep, that's a good one. And then, of course, there's a ton of websites, like Joanna Penn on her website has a whole page linking to editors, either that she has worked with herself or that she knows of. So there's definitely some kind of clearinghouse type, posts and things out there where you can get resources as well.
Yes, very, very good. Because, I mean, it's just one of those things, like looking for editors, you really have to find what's going to work best for you and your work. So, and the timeline, of course.
Yep, exactly.
That's fantastic. Well, Amy, thank you so much for being on this evening and chatting with us about editing. And I want to tell everyone that Amy does have a special guide available, and there will be a link to that right below the video. So it's called 10 Essential Questions to Ask Before You Hire an Editor. So definitely check that out. Click that link and go ahead and download it, and you'll be well on your way.
Excellent. Yeah. And if you have, if anyone listening has further questions, even if you're writing a fiction book and I can't help you myself, if you just have questions about some piece of the process or whatever, I'm happy to help out.
Oh, I love it. Well, thank you so much. And we'll be sending out a replay here shortly, so stay tuned.
Thanks, Angela.